Hello there, this is MTG Degree. My name is Luke, and today we're going to talk about an important topic, which is the concept of net decking versus homebrews. Now, let's quickly define those for people who don't know what they are. So, net decking is when you go to a place like MTG Top 8, you go look at a recent tournament, you find a winning deck list, and then you play that deck list. You don't make any changes or whatever, you just say, this won a tournament, it's probably pretty good, and you're right, it is quite good. And then homebrewing is where you find the set of cards that you want to play on your own, not too much internet influence, and you kind of make up your own strategy. And I think that this is typically what I would consider the more natural thing, because it is what really shows that somebody is a real beginner, you know? When they have no idea what's going online and they just say, these are all the sweet cards that I want to play, and they just play them. And that, I think, is kind of the original spirit of Magic. However, with the advent of the internet, we now have net decking as well, and is very important. So let's talk about both. Okay, let's go over Netdecks first. I think the first pro to Netdecks is that they are well-honed deck lists that have been play tested and worked on by thousands of people. So these end up as really well-refined lists that do exactly what they should be doing. They have smooth mana curves, and they're just very excellent. The next great thing about Netdecks is that they're well-known decks, and so you can often find pro advice on how to play them, how to sideboard with them, and you can find those on all sorts of websites such as like Channel Fireball, Star City Games. Basically, you name the website, there's probably a pro on there telling you how to play one of these well-known decks. So that really helps. The next thing is that these decks are intending to play against the whole field and probably have quite the good matchup against the entire field. There's no glaring weaknesses in the decks, most likely. So these will give you a really good chance of winning no matter who you're shuffling up against. And speaking of which, this is really the bottom line for Netdecks, which is that because they've been made by thousands of people, because they have basically the most powerful cards that people could find in the format, your chance of winning is frankly just the highest. If you just want to win games of Magic, you should probably be net decking. Okay, next let's go over the cons of net decking, because they are certainly there. The first one is that net decking is sort of a reactive thing. The deck has already won a tournament, and then you're looking to it for your next tournament. The problem with this is that sometimes, if the deck does very well, the rest of the field will be tuning their decks to beat that deck more soundly. So by investing in a net deck, you can sometimes put yourself where everyone's ready to beat you. An example from Standard in recent times has been the green-white Megamorph gain a crapload of life deck. That really shone in Standard tournaments for about a week or two, and then it was just gone. And I think that this is the effect that caused that. The next thing is that when you net deck, you might not know your deck that well because you didn't make it yourself. So, for example, do you know why a certain cheap removal spell is there? Is it there to stabilize you early? Is it there to get rid of big threats late? It's kind of hard to know, and without a lot of playing, you might not know why certain cards were included. The next downside to Netdecks is that they have a giant spotlight on them. Everyone knows what you're doing. So when they play against you, they have a pretty good idea of how they want to go about that. So for example, in Modern, I play Splinter Twin and beat somebody, they're gonna know the exact cards that they want to take out of their deck, the exact cards that they're bringing in from the sideboard, and how they want to approach me from that point onwards. Whereas if I was playing some unknown deck, then it adds a little bit of confusion into your opponent's mixture. The next con to Netdecks is that although they have a really well-made mana bases, if you ever want to tune them, and all you've ever done is net deck in your life, then you might find tuning mana bases to allow for the new cards that you want to be a very difficult experience. And so many times people make mistakes when adding cards to Netdecks. The last and most glaring con to Netdecks is that because everybody knows them and everyone recognizes them as powerful, the cards inside of Netdecks are often very expensive. So you can expect a Netdeck that's doing well to cost anywhere from hundreds to thousands of dollars depending on the format. And that is of course a huge drag because not everyone is made of money. This really brings us to our first great point about homebrews, which is that they typically cost a lot less money because the cards that you're using are a little off the radar, they're a little bit wonky, and so they're not ones that buyers know they can sell for a ton of money. You're gonna get them on the cheap. The next sweet thing about making your own deck is that because you made it yourself, you tested it yourself, you typically know the contents very well, so you'll never sit there with a fetch land thinking, do I have another blue source to fetch? You know your deck very well, so you'll just know, yes, I can get this, no, I can't get this. My outs are these 3 cards. And that kind of knowledge helps you play a much cleaner game. This knowledge of your deck really brings us to our next point, which is that you typically have a really good idea of all the interactions between your cards because you're the one that put them there. Whereas sometimes with Netdecks, it can be a little bit opaque. I think if you gave, modern eggs as a list to a player, they might have no idea looking at it how the heck it actually wins. Whereas if you make your own deck, you have a pretty darn good idea of what you were trying to do. So you'll have a good idea of how to get maximum value out of each card that you play. The next thing about homebrewing is that it really teaches you all of the cards available for the format. Because as you're looking through websites to find all the cards on something like Gatherer or magiccards.info, you're really seeing a huge amount of the cards that are relevant to the format. And so when you decide that you want to net deck, you'll be able to say, I remember this one card that would be really good right now, and this net deck might really benefit from it, at my local F&M. And so by homebrewing and learning more cards, you become a better tuner of Netdecks. The next thing about homebrews is that they are best at the start of a format, before the Netdecks have really been ground into a fine polish. Your homebrew has the best chance of winning and kind of taking an outside angle on the format before it's prepared. So when rotation has just happened or when a new set is released, that's really the time to homebrew it up. The next pro to this is that a homebrew, if you bring it to a tournament and it's really actually quite powerful and attacks the format from a different direction, you can completely dominate the format, which really leads us into the most important thing, which is that with good homebrewing and winning with a homebrew comes great glory. And I think this is really the thing that people latch on to the most, which is I completely destroyed that field of Netdecks with my homebrew that I came up with myself. And that feels pretty awesome, and other Magic players do recognize that as a real feat, a real accomplishment. Okay, let's get into the cons of homebrewing because they do exist. The first one is that as a single person or small group of people, you'll never be able to get in the playtesting that these Netdecks get. And so as a result, the deck structure usually ends up a little bit rough. It's not that perfectly polished diamond that Netdecks tend to be. And this really leads to the greatest weakness of the homebrew, which is that in really diverse metagames, it can be difficult to homebrew something that can fight against everything. Homebrews are strongest when they have one big target that they just want to smack. And so that can be a problem with homebrews, is that they're not always what you should be doing. The next problem with homebrews is that they can oftentimes be easily hated out. They are using cards which are probably not the absolute strongest cards, They're not using the most flexible cards. You're coming up with a really interesting new interaction, but that interaction is perhaps not that strong when people see it. So after they've seen it several times, they know how to break apart what you're trying to do. It can just end that homebrew in that metagame forever. So let's give an example of a bit of a rogue deck. Let's say you're playing Troll Worship in Modern, where you're just trying to stick this enchantment and saying, well, if they can't get rid of the enchantment, then I win the game, right? Well, that seems awesome, and it will be awesome to unprepared people, but if some people start picking up this deck, Troll Worship, and playing it at lots of tournaments, people are just gonna play enchantment removal, and then your deck is kind of sitting around doing almost nothing. And so that can be the huge downside, that you're putting all of your brewing power on some small interactions to win you the game. And so when those interactions get broken up, you're dead. Okay, so in conclusion, you should give the rest of the Magic community a lot of credit because there's a lot of them out there playing. And so there's probably a reason why X Homebrew isn't the best deck. And so if you really want to win, if you want to get to the next Pro Tour, your goal should just be to pick up Netdecks and play them and learn them inside and out. However, Homebrews do have their special situations at the start of formats when there's one really dominant deck that you're sure that you figured out a way to take down. And Homebrews also give you this wonderful ability to learn all of the cards in a format so that you know when is the time to pull out one that you saw as a special candidate. So should you net deck? Should you homebrew? You should probably do both.